What is up, everybody? Welcome back to Rough Drafts. My name is Sam Pratt. If you haven't joined me before, in this podcast, I go really deep on certain topics in the current limited format. So we're talking cards, decks, drafting concepts, and today is going to be more on the conceptual side. We're going to talk mid-range, and specifically, I'm going to look at mid-range through the lens of Abzan Midrange, which I will admit, I think is one of the worst decks in the format. So I think this is going to be an interesting way to frame it. I'm going to go in depth on what mid-range really means, why mid-range is not as successful in Tarkir as it has been in other limited formats, and when you actually do want to draft mid-range in Tarkir Dragonstorm. So first off, a little bit of definitions here. So what is mid-range? What does mid-range mean? The way that I would define mid-range is a deck that has a flexible game plan and focuses on card quality. So basically, if you consider your deck a mid-range deck, you are playing the role of the control deck against the aggro decks and the role of the aggro deck against the control decks. So what this translates to in limited is you want a lot of cards that are just good on their own, and a lot of times that manifests itself as 2-for-1s. Or, cards that are maybe 1.5-for-1s, things that give you always just a little bit of extra value. People are usually pretty good about understanding the role a mid-range deck would take against an aggro deck. That they're going to be the control deck against an aggro deck. A mid-range deck is often going to want to play a lot of removal. You're going to want to play bigger creatures than the aggro deck, so you can outscale them and end the game. What I think a lot of people miss about true mid-range decks in limited is you need to be the aggro deck against the control deck. And what that means is you need a very high closing speed. So if you take a look at some of the most famous mid-range decks in Magic's history from constructed formats, you'll notice that while they're playing a lot of removal, like things that act as control cards against the aggro decks, one of the hallmarks of these mid-range decks is threats that scale really well into the late game and can close the game really fast. So I think the most famous mid-range deck is Modern Jund Midrange, and Tarmogoyf was their closer. Tarmogoyf is a card that is just 2 mana and could scale really easily to like a 4/5, a 5/6. So the game plan was to use that as kind of a blocker against the aggro decks, and then it closes the game really fast against control decks. A really similar card would be Death Shadow. Those Grixis Death Shadow decks in Old Modern would become enormous threats kind of in the mid game, and they'd be able to close the game very, very quickly. So I think this actually translates quite well to limited. If you are a true mid-range deck, you want closing speed, and that's why green plays such a good mid-range role generally. And just to throw this out here, I've talked about Who's the Beatdown on this podcast before a couple episodes ago. I want to plug that article. It's a very old Magic article from like 1999 or 2000. That's really describes how to play mid-range to a T. You need to analyze what role you're playing in the matchup, and that role is going to shift through the matchups, because when you're playing against an aggro deck as a mid-range deck, you need to be able to turn the corner really fast so they don't draw into their reach spells, like burn spells or something like that. And you need to be able to kill the control decks before they can leverage their card advantage. So mid-range is really good in most limited formats, and this is all kind of wishy-washy, but the reason that it's good is because 1, removal is good, and 2, just creatures that are good, that are large, that provide you extra value, those tend to be just very good cards in limited. So that begs the question, why is mid-range not performing well in Tarkir Dragonstorm? I want to look at that through the lens of card quality. So usually mid-range decks are just playing very good cards up the curve, and then they're using those to close the game. The problem in this format is the fixing is so good and so forgiving that the card quality in your average 2-3 color mid-range deck is going to get absolutely outscaled by the 5-color deck or the 4 or 5 colored dragons deck. There's a saying in constructed Magic that is, you could put it 2 ways. It could be, don't be the smaller mid-range deck, or always be the bigger mid-range deck. Because in mid-range mirrors, the player with the card advantage is usually going to be favored. And I think in this format, the number one thing that is punishing these mid-range decks is just automatically losing to the 5-color soup decks that could get to play a ton of bombs. They aren't getting super pressured by the mid-range decks, so they have time to fix their mana, go up the curve, and just start slamming a ton of dragons. So you might be wondering, why would I ever want to be a true mid-range deck, just a true card quality mid-range deck in Tarkir? And the answer to me lies in rares. Sometimes your clan is just open. I want to be very careful in how I phrase this because I think that rares a lot of time, like if you have a deck that has a lot of good rares, a lot of people would look at that and say, oh, you just got lucky, you have a lot of rares. It was so lucky to open that many rares in your colors. And while that's definitely true, there are definitely a lot of times where you just get hooked up. Play boosters have really shifted the way that I think about rares in how they integrate with the draft format in general. And I think it's a good thing to be mindful of the power of your deck in terms of how many rares you have and how many rares you can expect to get opened in your colors and pass to you. So something I've been thinking about in my drafts in the last couple formats, something I've been thinking about more, is clocking the power level of my deck as the draft goes on. So if I start with a really good rare, that is a reason to go deep into that rare's colors because I already know that I have quite a bit of power in those colors and I'm going to be able to build my deck around that. On the other end of the spectrum, if my lane is pretty open and I know I can build a powerful synergistic deck, say I start with some white cards and Boros aggro in this set is really open, then I don't really need rares because I know that I have a very powerful synergistic deck. Then there's this kind of third option where you kind of are just taking good cards. Say you take some really solid removal spells, you take some decent commons through pack 1, and you get to the end of pack 1 and you look at the cards in your pool and you're like, yeah, I have good removal, I have a decent curve already, but I don't really have a plan. I really like trying to stay open when I'm in those kind of drafts, specifically trying to stay deep into one color and wait for a lane to present itself to me. I mentioned this a couple episodes ago, but play boosters have really upped the number of gold rares per set. And because there are, in a normal set, there's 10 color pairs and only 8 drafters, there's going to be some gold rares that get opened that people can't play. And a lot of those gold rares get passed and go flying around the table in packs 2 and 3. So putting yourself, if you don't have a clear direction in your draft, putting yourself in a position to pick up those rares is a really good spot to be, especially because we get just more rares in play boosters in general. And even though the gold rare situation in Dragonstorm is pretty weird because 1, there's only 5 clans, and 2, the 5 color deck is really good. There are a lot of times that the straight 3 color rares do go pretty far on the table, and I've actually found that Abzan, that happens quite a bit. So in order to exemplify this thinking of searching for power and tying that back into a mid-range deck, and when you do want to draft a mid-range deck in Tarkir, I'm going to go over a paper draft I had over the weekend. So pack 1, pick 1, I took Scavenger Regent. This is the rare black Omen Dragon. It's a 4-mana 4/4 and has a Wrath Omen. It's a great card. I would pretty easily take it over, I think, every uncommon and every common. It is black, which I do think is the worst color in the format. It's strong enough that I'm pretty happy taking it anyway. But I'm keeping that in mind as I'm drafting. And then I believe pick 2 and pick 3, I picked up Dragon's Prey and Caustic Exhale. And I know that Dragon's Prey isn't amazing. It was a pretty weak pack. And I know that getting deep into black is kind of risky, but I have this powerful black card and I just want to build a functional deck around it. And then pick 4, I get past Yathan Roadwatcher. So this is a 4-mana Abzan card. It's a 3/3, and when it enters, you mill 4, and then you get to return a creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this is an Abzan card, and I don't want to get into Abzan, but if I'm in black, I'm pretty excited to go down green-black. And I've played with this card. I checked the data when I was playing it, and this card is quite good. And I knew that getting it pick 4 meant that Abzan was going to be pretty open for my right. So I dove in. And I definitely wanted to keep open for a green stompy deck. I think that green-black specifically is best suited to a counters beatdown deck, with Champion of Dusans and stuff. And I'm not super experienced with white-black so far. So from then on out, I was just committed to, I'm going to be Abzan. I'm going to figure out what's happening in the draft. And it turns out that green was not very open at all, but black and Abzan specifically was pretty open. So I was clocking during that draft that the Beatdown counters deck that I really like to draft in green black was not going to be open. And I said, I have these two really good rares. I'm just going to build a very normal Magic deck with a good curve of creatures, a bunch of removal, a couple 2-for-1s, and I'm going to find my rares and I'm going to cast them and I'm going to win like that. And I will be very clear, I do not want to draft a deck like this in Tarkir unless I have really powerful rares like Scavenger Regent and Yathan Roadwatcher. And those aren't even like the best rares in the set. So at the end of the draft, I also ended up with Laced Prowler, which is the 4-mana 5/5 in green rare, and a Parination, which is the Abzan Mythic removal spell. And I'll link a picture to this deck in the episode description because I think it's a pretty good example of a good Abzan midrange deck. So I ended up with 5 removal spells, a very good curve of creatures. I have 2s, 3s, 4s. I have Champion of Doosan, Sagu Pummeler, a couple really good of the uncommon Stormbroods, like the Disruptive Stormbrood. And then I have a couple of Gurmag Rakshasas at the top end. And this is not a generically good card. And I don't even think it's great in the green, black counters beatdown because it's a 6-drop. But if you look at this in the lens of just generic midrange, this card is pretty often a 2-for-1 and it pushes damage. So it kind of fits both roles of, it's going to stabilize you against aggro, even though it's a 6-drop. And it's a 5/5 menace that pushes damage also. So it's going to be really good at pushing damage against the control decks. So I was in green-black mostly. I have a lot of good interactions to stabilize me against aggro decks. I have a really good curve of creatures to sort of beat down against the slower decks and turn the corner against the aggro decks. What I was missing was card advantage. So I have a couple card advantage creatures. I have the Yathan Roadwatcher. I have Disruptive Stormbrood, which blows up an artifact or enchantment when it enters. The Rakshasas are more or less 2-for-1s. But I felt that I was going to just play my creatures and run out of cards, and the aggro decks could eventually draw and find some burn, or the control decks were just going to draw their bombs and win. So I slotted in 2 cards that I haven't really cast in this format. Cruel Truths, which is 4 mana, surveil 2, draw 2, lose 2. And Whale of War, which is 3 mana. You either give all of your opponent's creatures -1/-1, or return up to 2 target creatures from your graveyard to your hand. And because a lot of my good cards were creatures, Whale of War was really good. I was very often hoping I was going to just draw my Whale of War, return key creatures like Roadwatcher, you could loop it with that, or the good dragons or my Rakshasas. So yeah, this is a really sweet deck. I did trophy with it. I've trophied with a different one that was, more closer to the green-black beatdown counters deck, but didn't quite have a lot of the tricks and pushing damage. So I do want to touch on that really quick. There's a pretty subtle difference between a straight mid-range deck and more of a beatdown aggro deck. And that is those edges where in this deck, my curve of creatures is good, but I know that just the curve isn't going to put enough pressure on the opponent to be a true aggro deck. So if I was a true counters beatdown deck, instead of running those Cruel Truths and Whale of War and the Rakshasas at the top end, I would be a lot happier with stuff like Sarkhan's Resolve, which is the +3/+3, Synchronized Charge, which is the thing that distributes counters, things that push damage. Because my deck was a little slower, a little more removal heavy, I really want those card advantage spells. So I think that's something important to note when you're drafting is, do I have the juice to really kill the opponent here? Or do I need to pull back and play a little more conservatively? I have enough removal to not die, to be able to answer my opponent's key threats. I just want to make the game go a little longer so I can find my best cards and kill the opponent. So I've covered Abzan, and I also want to touch on what you can do in the mid-range space in the other clans as well. I do think that a true mid-range deck is going to be best suited to be closer to a 3-color deck than a 2-color deck. And by that, I mean you're probably going to be splashing multiple cards, because I think you get into this space by getting past good 3-color rares and uncommons. I would have happily played a Skirmish Rhino in that deck. So Temur midrange is a space I've ended up in quite a bit. You get some really busted rares in Temur. There's Ureni and Dragonback Assault at Mythic, and I think those are better in the 5-color Dragonstorm control decks than they are in true midrange. So if I open those, I'm shooting more for that. But I'm talking more about Roar of the Endless Song and Eshki. If I open those pack 1, or if I'm already in green or blue and I open those later, I think just a very generic mid-range deck, you play good curve creatures, great removal, focus on those bombs, like finding them, casting them, winning with them. I think that's a great place to be for Teamer. You get Card Kick Guardian as a really sweet finisher at the top end. That's the Teamer Dragon, like 6/5 hexproof. Jeskai. I end up in Jeskai midrange quite a bit too, and this is because a couple of its rares go really late. Flamehold Grappler, which is the 3-mana Jeskai card. It's a 3/3 first strike, and then your next spell you cast that turn gets copied. And Rediscover the Way, which is the Jeskai Saga that kind of impulses 2 times. Like, you look at the top 3, pick one, and then it can give things double strike. I see these cards go pretty late in a lot of drafts, and I'm base blue quite a bit, so I end up being like a Jeskai mid-range deck for these cards pretty often. Like these don't exactly fit in the blue-red flurry tempo deck, and they're good in Jeskai Control, which is kind of the other Jeskai space I end up in. But sometimes you just have good removal, you have a good curve, etc., like I've been saying the whole episode. Mardu midrange. This is another thing that I've seen people talk about. I think I've drafted this. I can't specifically remember. But Sonic Shrieker, the gold Mardu uncommon dragon. This is a 5-mana 4/4 with flying, and when it enters, you deal 2 to any target, and if it's a player, they discard a card, and you gain 2 life. Yeah, this is like the ultimate mid-range card. It gains you life to stabilize. It's a 2-for-1. It can pick off a creature or make them discard a card. It closes really fast. It's a 5-mana 4/4 flyer. Yeah, very, very good mid-range card. It kind of gets eaten up by these Dragonstorm decks, but, if you are in deep in black, like if I was in the draft I went through, if I was deep in black like that, like I had Scavenger Regent, Dragon's Prey, and I got past a Sonic Shrieker instead of a Yathan Roadwatcher, I would be all in on Mardu midrange at that point. I think that would be a great place to be. And in a similar vein, there's like Black-White, which is a deck I have not drafted at all in this format, but it's really something I want to crack. I think there's something there in terms of like a mid-range token deck with the 3-mana 1/3. It's a Nightblade Brigade, I believe. 3-mana 1/3, enters, surveil 1, has mobilize 1. Oh, and it has Death Touch. There's a lot of like grindy cards, like the Black-White uncommon that can sack tokens to draw cards. I think there's something really cool in the mid-range space there, and I think you would get into it either with the Mardu rares or with Sonic Shriekers, which is one of the best uncommons in the set. I'm going to close out the episode by just talking through a bunch of cards that if you do find yourself in this kind of no plan, generically good mid-range space, which does happen to me like a decent amount at this point in the format, cards that are just kind of generically good in this mid-range plan. Just want to point out a couple of them. I'm going to go kind of in color order, but starting with gold cards. I want to talk about the monuments very briefly. I mentioned a couple episodes ago that I see these as basically 2-for-1s. They're basically draw 2s. They draw you a land and then kind of a weirdly costed creature. They're like basically, I hate assigning number values to cards, but they're kind of like a 1.7 for 1. Yeah, just a great mid-range card. All of the monuments. Some other gold uncommons. There is Disruptive Stormbrood, which is the green-black Omen Dragon. Has like a kill spell on the Omen side, and then it's a 5-mana 3/3 flying. When it enters, destroy an artifact or enchantment. A lot of artifacts or enchantments to blow up in this set, so, kind of a 2-for-1. Mammoth Bellow, the 5-mana make a 5/5 with Harmonize. This is a 2-for-1. 2 5/5s. The 5/5s close the game out really well. If I'm in a teamer mid-range space, I think that is the best spot for Mammoth Bellow, because you don't really want to stretch your mana in the like green-blue or green-red beatdown decks. In a similar vein to Disruptive Stormbrood, I think most of the Stormbroods are a great mid-range card. I'll call it the Black-White one, which is a 5-mana 4/4 that removes counters and then has this like hexproof trick for the Omen, and then Twin Maw Stormbrood, which is the 6-mana 5/4, gain 5 with Roast as the Omen. These are just like very solid cards, very good amounts of value on either half. The flexibility is amazing for these mid-range decks. Just kind of going rapid fire through these. A couple gold cards I really like. Skirmish Rhino. I think a mid-range deck is the best home for this because you're happiest stretching your mana there. And Sonic Streaker, like I mentioned. In white, like I said, I have my eye on black-white as a potential home for a mid-range deck. Salt Road Pack Beast is kind of labeled as an aggro card because you want to go wide. But if you see the tokens as kind of extra value instead of ways to push damage, Salt Road Pack Beast is a cantripping creature, which is fantastic for these decks. I will call out Wayspeaker Bodyguard, which is a 4-mana 3/4 at uncommon. When it enters, you return a permanent with non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand, and then has this flurry ability to tap creatures. If you can pick up a Monument with this card is awesome. Really good in my Jeskai midrange deck because I love the Jeskai Monument. Great card. Blue should be pretty self-explanatory. I want to call it Sibsig Appraiser as the perfect midrange card. It's a body, it draws a card, puts something in the graveyard, just fantastic. I already mentioned a lot of good black midrange cards like Cruel Truths, Whale of War, Gurmag Rakshasa. I do want to touch on Aggressive Negotiations, which is the 3 mana. Your opponent reveals their hand, you exile a card, and then you get a 1/1 counter. It's not a 2-for-1. A counter is not a card. It's like a 1.3-for-1. Controlling the game with discards a hallmark of constructed mid-range decks. Think Jund midrange, Black-Red midrange, and Pioneer. This definitely would play well in a black mid-range deck in this format too. In red, 2 uncommons, Equilibrium Adept, which is the 4-mana 2/4. You get to exile a card. 2-for-1, great. And Sunset Strike Master. This is the 2-mana mana dork. It also has the weird 3-mana deal 6 to a flying creature. Just a very solid card. And I'm not saying anything groundbreaking here. You just want good cards, and this is a good card. It's very flexible. It has high power to close the game out. It trades up on mana. Yeah, fantastic. In green, a couple 2-for-1 cards. Antioch Wayfarer. That's the 2-mana 1/1 that mills 3. You get a land. That's basically a 2-for-1. Traveling Botanist. Super overrate. Good body against the aggro decks. Attacks really well into the defensive decks. Draws you lands. Card is great. Champion of Doosan. My pet card of the format. It's definitely at its best in these beatdown decks. 4/2 body is great there. Specifically in mid-range decks, that extra counter is definitely a little bit of extra value. And it trades really well in this format because you want to do a lot of trading in mid-range decks. So yeah, I like this card basically in every green deck that isn't a dedicated ramp deck. And no one is going to be surprised that I love this card. And I think I'm going to wrap it up there. A little bit of a shorter episode today, a little bit of a more abstract episode today, kind of winding down on the bigger picture deck buckets that I can cover. So next week, I'm hoping to cover kind of a real grab bag of cards and topics. So I'm going to pick a bunch of cards that I want to talk about. I've had a couple suggestions on certain things and concepts and packages to talk about. So yeah, we'll get in the nitty gritty next week. If you have any feedback about the show, if you want to say hi, if you want to suggest something for me to talk about, I'd love to hear it. You can find me on Blue Sky at sampratt.bsky.social. And you can find me on Discord at samp6. I also very occasionally have been streaming on Twitch at samp_MTG. Thanks for listening and see you next week.